I am 76 years old, and the days in my little Iowa town tend to move so slowly that sometimes I wonder if time has given up on me altogether, if it no longer sees the point of carrying me forward with the same force it once did when my wife was alive, when the children were young, when there was always some reason to get up with expectation. These days my mornings are quiet, almost ceremonial in their simplicity. I put the kettle on, grind beans with the same old manual grinder I bought in 1972, and sit at the kitchen table while the light comes in through curtains my late wife sewed decades ago. I watch that light shift across the surface of the table, hitting the scratches and stains, each one a relic of meals and arguments and celebrations that used to fill this house. My house. It still feels odd to say it that way, because for most of my life it was our house, and now there is no one to share the pronoun with. I live alone, and while I like to tell myself that solitude is a chosen discipline, the truth is that it was given to me, not requested. My wife, Ruth, passed away from cancer 10 years ago, leaving me with walls that remember more than they should, and with children who stopped calling as often as they once did. They have their lives, their families, their businesses to run. I am, to them, a distant figure, whose presence is acknowledged mostly on birthdays and holidays, and even then it is often through a phone call rather than a visit. I try to keep myself in good order, to present a version of myself to the world that resists the narrative of decline that comes so easily to people once they notice your hair has thinned and your hands shake if you pour from a heavy pot. Every morning I shave, though I no longer have anyone to notice if I miss a spot under my chin. I polish my shoes on Sundays, even though the church congregation has dwindled, and nobody would care if I walked in with dusty loafers. I maintain the small patch of garden behind the house, stubbornly pulling weeds and planting tomatoes as if the ritual itself could keep me rooted in dignity. My neighbors, most of them younger couples with small children, look at me with a mixture of politeness and pity, and sometimes I catch them lowering their voices when they speak about me. He's still managing on his own, one of them once said to another as I dragged my trash bin to the curb, as if I were a museum piece, an exhibit in the fragile persistence of old age. Inside myself, though, I do not feel finished. My mind is still alert, my memory intact. I read the newspaper each morning and do the crossword in pen, not pencil. I keep up with the news, follow baseball, reread the old books I loved when I was a student. I even use the computer. Slowly, clumsily perhaps, but I check emails and occasionally watch videos online. It annoys me, therefore, when my children treat me as if I am already slipping away. My daughter Claire visits the most, though even she only comes once every few weeks. She breezes into the house carrying grocery bags and speaking in that loud, bright tone people use when they talk to the elderly, as though we have become not only deaf, but dim-witted too. She rearranges my kitchen cupboards without asking, insists on labeling jars and putting sticky notes on the refrigerator, and while she says she is helping, I know what she is really doing, preparing for a time when she thinks I will no longer be capable of managing. My son, Mark, rarely sets foot in the house anymore. He calls from his car on the way to meetings, always rushed, always distracted, and his voice carries the weight of someone doing his duty rather than speaking with love. "How are you doing, Dad? Taking your meds? Not climbing ladders, right?" His questions are practical, perfunctory, as though he were checking boxes on a form. When I tell him I am fine, he sighs as if I am being stubborn, as if my refusal to exhibit helplessness is itself a problem. The truth is, I have grown used to this distance, though it still stings. I eat my meals alone, and sometimes imagine conversations that might fill the silence. My wife laughing about something small, my grandchildren telling me stories from school. They rarely come. When they were little, They used to run through this house like a storm, opening cupboards, begging for cookies, dragging out board games. Now they are in college, or close to it, and they look at me with that polite embarrassment young people reserve for the old, unsure whether to hug me or just wave. I try not to resent them. After all, the world pulls them forward with urgency. But I do feel the erosion, the slow fading of my place in the family, as if I were a photograph left too long in the sun. And yet, I cling to certain beliefs. I believe that I still have something to offer, that I am still capable of making decisions about my own life. I believe that the years I worked, decades spent in the factory, saving, paying off this house, raising children, should count for something, should buy me at least the right to live the remainder of my life on my own terms. But lately I have felt currents moving beneath the surface, conversations happening outside my hearing, decisions being made with polite smiles that conceal something colder. Claire sometimes lingers too long looking at my bills on the table. Mark once suggested, almost casually, that it might be easier if I downsized into a place with more support. They use the language of concern, but beneath it I hear calculation. Easier for whom? Support for what? I notice how they glance at each other when I fumble for a word, or when I misplace my glasses. They exaggerate these moments, seize on them as evidence of fragility. And perhaps I do forget things sometimes. Who doesn't? But when they sigh and trade glances, I feel as if they are rehearsing a narrative, one where I am no longer competent, no longer reliable, no longer in control. It is a strange feeling, to be spoken about in the past tense while you are still sitting in the room. It makes you want to shout, to prove that you are not yet gone. But pride keeps me silent. I let them believe I do not notice. In the evenings, when the house grows dark and the cicadas hum outside, I think back to the early years of our family, when this home was noisy and full, when Ruth and I stayed up late making plans about the future. I ask myself where exactly things turned. Did I fail in some way? Did I raise children too practical, too eager to move on? Or is this simply the fate of age, that no matter how much you give, you end up reduced in their eyes to a set of problems to be managed? I cannot answer those questions. I only know that I want to hold on to myself, my dignity, my freedom, as long as possible. This is the life I inhabit as the story begins. A man not yet broken, but increasingly aware that others have already begun to write his ending. They think of me as someone sliding toward dependence, someone who should be guided, redirected, perhaps even contained. And while I try to ignore it, while I try to take comfort in my daily routines, a part of me fears that the day is coming when they will no longer ask what I want, but instead will decide for me. That thought lingers in the corners of my mind like a shadow. I do not yet know what it will mean, but I feel it waiting. It began innocently enough, in the way that these things often do, without thunderclaps or any sudden sense of catastrophe. Just the small, ordinary incident of my foot slipping on the wooden steps leading down from the back porch. It was early spring, the boards still damp with the last frost of the season, and I had gone out to refill the bird feeder, a chore I performed with stubborn regularity, even though the birds had become less frequent visitors these past years. My heel caught on the edge, I lost my balance, and though I did not fall completely, I went down to one knee hard enough to leave a bruise and twist my ankle. It was not serious. I have weathered worse. A man who worked decades in a factory has lived through countless knocks and strains. But it was enough that when my daughter saw the swelling later that week, she drew in her breath with exaggerated alarm and declared that I needed to see the doctor. I told her it was unnecessary, that I had already wrapped the ankle, that it would heal with time, but she insisted with the persistence of someone who has already decided. "Dad, we can't take chances anymore. You're not 25. What if it had been your hip?" I tried to protest, but eventually, perhaps out of fatigue more than anything, I agreed to let her drive me to the clinic. The waiting room was filled with the usual smells of disinfectant and the low murmur of daytime television playing in the corner. I sat there with a magazine on my lap, pretending to read while Claire filled out forms at the desk, her handwriting quick and sharp. I could see her leaning close to the receptionist, whispering something, both of them occasionally glancing at me. I told myself I was imagining it, but when the nurse finally called my name, she spoke with the kind of overly bright cheer that people use with children. The examination itself was unremarkable. Blood pressure, reflexes, a quick look at the ankle, which by then had already begun to improve. The doctor, a young man who seemed scarcely older than my grandson, asked perfunctory questions about diet and medication. I answered politely, though I could sense his gaze searching for signs of frailty. At the end, he scribbled notes on his pad, handed me a slip for anti-inflammatory pills, and said I should be fine as long as I avoided climbing ladders. I was about to leave when Claire asked if she could have a copy of the visit summary, just to keep track. He nodded, printed out a sheet, and handed it to her. I thought nothing of it at the time. It was later that evening, after she had dropped me back home and hurried away to pick up her own children from practice, that I noticed she had left the summary sheet on the kitchen counter. I was tidying up, putting away the bread she had bought and the milk she insisted I needed, when I saw the folded paper tucked under the grocery receipt. I unfolded it, expecting to see the standard notes. Mild ankle sprain, recommendation to rest, continue with usual medication. And yes, those phrases were there, but at the bottom, in the section labeled Additional Recommendations, was a line that froze me in place. It read, "Consider transfer to nursing facility for long-term safety and care." I must have stared at those words for several minutes, reading and rereading them as though the repetition might make them dissolve. Transfer. Nursing facility. Long-term. The language was clinical, detached, but to me it rang with finality, as if a verdict had been passed without my knowledge. My first reaction was disbelief. Surely this was a clerical mistake, some generic note that appeared automatically, something the doctor had not really meant. But then I remembered the way Claire had spoken in the office, the way she leaned toward the receptionist, the sidelong glances, the manner in which she had taken the summary so quickly, almost protectively. It dawned on me that perhaps she had requested this, that perhaps she had guided the doctor into writing something for the record, a small but significant seed planted in my file. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of anger and fear. Anger because of the betrayal implied. Fear because of the possibility that this was more than just a piece of paper, that it was the beginning of a plan. When she called the next day to ask if I had taken the pills, I asked casually about the note. There was a pause on the line, a hesitation too brief for someone untrained to notice, but long enough for me to feel the truth behind it. Then she laughed lightly, as if dismissing my concern. "Oh, Dad, don't worry about that. Doctors put those kinds of things on all the reports once people get to a certain age. It doesn't mean anything." I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that this was bureaucratic noise, nothing more, but the laugh had been forced, and the reassurance rang hollow. Later that week, Mark called, his voice brisk as always. He said Claire had told him about the ankle, and that maybe it was time to start thinking realistically. I asked what he meant by that, though I already knew. He spoke about safety, about the statistics of falls being the leading cause of hospitalization for older people. He used the word responsibility several times, as if I were no longer just a man, but a liability, a case file. "It might be safer for everyone if you were somewhere with more support," he said. And when I asked him directly if he meant a nursing home, he did not deny it. Instead, he sighed, the sound of exasperated patience. "We just don't want anything to happen to you, Dad. You might not see it, but it's getting harder for you to manage." That night I sat alone at the kitchen table with the doctor's note beside me, the paper illuminated by the weak light of the lamp. I traced the words with my finger as if to make sure they were real. I thought about what it would mean to be removed from this house, the place where every wall holds memory, where every corner contains some trace of Ruth, where I can still close my eyes and hear the echoes of children's laughter. To be taken from here and placed in some facility, no matter how clean or well run, would be to declare that my life had been reduced to supervision. I imagined a narrow bed, a roommate I did not know, schedules dictated by staff, the loss of privacy, the loss of my small rituals. And I imagined my children visiting only occasionally, satisfied that they had done their duty by putting me away, free at last to live without the burden of my presence. I cannot describe the weight of that realization. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. For years I had feared the slow approach of irrelevance, but here it was, written in black ink, sanctioned by a doctor, validated by my own children. The note was not just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of intent, the first step in a process that could strip me of the only thing I still owned entirely, my independence. And yet I said nothing. The next time Claire came by, I mentioned only that the ankle was improving. She smiled, patted my shoulder, and said she was glad. But I noticed how her eyes moved quickly around the house, scanning the bills on the counter, the dishes in the sink, the stack of newspapers by the door, as if gathering evidence. She spoke gently, but her words were laced with a kind of determination, the tone of someone already convinced of the course ahead. I nodded, pretended not to understand, but inside I felt the first tremors of a storm. That was the moment the balance shifted, though I did not fully grasp it then. What began as a simple misstep on the porch had become the pretext for something much larger, a chain of events I could already feel tightening around me. The doctor's note was small, a single page, yet it carried the weight of a verdict, and as I folded it back into the envelope and slid it into the drawer beside my chair, I knew instinctively that my children would not let it rest there. It was a seed, and seeds are planted only when someone intends to see them grow. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice how small details of my life, details that had once passed without comment, suddenly became points of concern, or rather points of accusation, as if the world around me were quietly collecting evidence. For a case in which I was both the subject and the defendant, Claire came more often, not with the casual warmth of a daughter dropping by, but with the brisk authority of someone performing inspections. She would glance at the dust on the bookshelf, the stack of envelopes on the hall table, and ask in a voice too sweet to be sincere, "Dad, are you sure you're keeping up with everything?" I would reply that of course I was, but she would smile in that indulgent way that suggested she did not believe me, or perhaps that she had already decided it did not matter what I believed about myself. Once she opened the refrigerator and frowned at the contents. "You've had these leftovers for days, haven't you? That's not safe." I wanted to tell her that I had been eating the same stew for 3 days my entire working life, that nothing had changed except the lens through which she now chose to see me, but I held my tongue, aware that my words would only become another exhibit against me, proof of stubbornness, of denial, of the inability to recognize risk. It was not only Claire. My son, too, seemed to have joined this quiet tribunal. He began calling more frequently, but his questions were laced with the same patronizing suspicion. "Are you taking your pills on time? You didn't forget your last appointment, right? Have you been paying your bills?" When I told him yes, everything was in order, he would pause, as though weighing whether to challenge me. Once he even asked me to read the numbers off my electric bill over the phone, as if I needed to prove I was not inventing competence out of thin air. When I read them to him, he muttered something about just making sure and quickly ended the call. I sat there afterward with the phone heavy in my hand, a strange shame creeping into me, not because I had done anything wrong, but because my own children no longer accepted my word as truth. It was as if the presumption of honesty, the baseline of respect that should flow naturally between parent and child, had been quietly withdrawn. The more they pressed, the more I found myself doubting my own instincts. One morning I mislaid my reading glasses and spent 20 minutes searching the kitchen before realizing they were hanging from the collar of my shirt. When I finally found them, instead of laughing at the silliness of it, I felt a pang of dread, imagining how Claire would react if she had been present. She would not have seen the ordinary absent-mindedness of a man with too many thoughts in his head. She would have seen confirmation of decline, the kind of lapse that fits neatly into the narrative of someone unfit to live alone. I began hiding these small mistakes, careful never to mention them, for fear they would be twisted into something larger. And then there were the little humiliations, subtle but cutting, that slipped into our conversations. At dinner one evening, Claire asked if I wanted her to cut my meat for me. As if I were a child, I stared at her, knife and fork already in my hands, and said quietly that I was fine. But she smiled in that same way, a smile that said she knew better. Mark, on another visit, insisted on checking my medicine cabinet, counting the pills to make sure I was taking them correctly. I wanted to snatch the bottles away, to shout that I had been managing my own health longer than he had been alive. But instead I stood silently while he performed his inventory, my face burning. There is a peculiar kind of pain in being treated as both invisible and intrusive at once. Invisible because your judgment no longer matters, intrusive because your very existence is seen as a burden to be managed. It was during this time that I began to overhear fragments of conversations not meant for me. Once, as Claire was leaving after one of her visits, I heard her on the phone just outside the door. "He's not coping as well as he thinks," she said, her voice low but clear. "We'll have to start making arrangements sooner rather than later." Another time, I picked up the phone to call a friend, only to hear a click and realize Claire had been speaking with Mark on the same line before I dialed. I caught only a few words: facility, waiting list, doctor's recommendation, but they were enough to chill me. The words seemed to gather in my ears like a sentence already written, one in which my role was passive, where decisions about me were being made without me. One Sunday afternoon, Claire came by with a stack of papers she said were helpful resources. I spread them out on the table after she left, my hands trembling slightly. They were glossy brochures for retirement communities, assisted living centers, nursing facilities. Smiling elderly couples filled the photographs, their silver hair catching the sunlight as they played cards, painted, took walks on manicured lawns. The captions spoke of peace of mind, 24-hour support, a vibrant community. I stared at those images, feeling a wave of nausea. They were advertisements for surrender, for handing over the final fragments of self-determination. And beneath the cheerful marketing I could hear the real message. Here is where you will be put when your usefulness has been measured and found wanting. I could no longer pretend this was just a misunderstanding. The doctor's note had not been an isolated remark. It was the cornerstone of a structure being built around me, brick by brick, a case assembled by my own children. Each forgotten word, each unpaid bill that sat a day too long on the counter, each leftover in the fridge, all of it was evidence, compiled and whispered about in conversations from which I was excluded. It was as though I had become a defendant in a trial held behind closed doors, with verdicts passed in absentia. One evening, determined to know the truth, I confronted Claire. I asked her directly if she and Mark were planning something, if they were discussing arrangements for me without my consent. She smiled that tight smile and shook her head. "Dad, you're imagining things. We're just worried about you." "That's what families do." But even as she said it, her eyes shifted, flicking away from mine for just an instant too long. I knew then that she was lying, and the realization pierced me deeper than any physical wound. To be lied to by your child, to see them regard you not as a father, but as a problem to be solved, it is a betrayal that corrodes the soul. After she left, I sat in my chair long into the night, the brochures still spread on the table before me, the doctor's note tucked in the drawer, the phone silent at my side. I realized with a clarity that frightened me that I was no longer merely living my life. I was defending it, silently, against those who once depended on me, and now conspired to take from me the last possession I truly valued, my right to choose how and where I would live. And though I had not yet spoken my defiance aloud, I felt it gathering in me like a storm, a quiet determination that if they were going to push me into that fate, they would not find me as compliant as they imagined. The turning point came not with some dramatic confrontation, not with shouting or slammed doors, but in the stillness of an ordinary afternoon when I happened to rise from my chair more quietly than usual and overheard what was never meant for my ears. Claire had come by to drop off groceries, and while she thought I was in the back room sorting laundry, she stepped into the kitchen with her phone pressed tightly to her ear. I heard her voice, low and urgent, speaking not with the casual tones of a daughter, but with the clipped certainty of someone finalizing arrangements. "Yes, he's still insisting he's fine," she was saying. "But he doesn't realize how much he's slipping. We can't keep putting it off, Mark. The doctor already noted it in his file. If we wait too long, the situation will only get worse. I'll call the social worker tomorrow and see if we can get him on the list." The word struck me harder than any physical blow could have. On the list. Not a suggestion, not a conversation to be had with me, but a decision already unfolding. My name spoken like an item of business on a to-do sheet. I remained in the hallway, frozen, my breath caught in my chest, while Claire continued her hushed conversation. She mentioned safety, liability, and then, in a tone that revealed more than she perhaps intended, "The house is too much for him. He doesn't even realize it." I felt the blood rush to my face, my hands trembling against the doorframe as the meaning became clear. This was not just about concern for my health. It was about the house, about property, about what would be easier for them once I was tucked away somewhere, and this place, my place, could be emptied, valued, sold, turned into another stepping stone in their lives. In that moment, the doctor's note, the brochures, the constant condescension, all of it fused together into a pattern I could no longer deny. When she left an hour later, smiling sweetly and telling me to be careful on the stairs, I nodded without reply, concealing the storm inside me. As soon as the door shut, I walked to my desk, opened the drawer where I had hidden the doctor's summary, and read the line again. Transfer to nursing facility for long-term safety and care. Now it was no longer an abstract threat. It was a plan in motion, and the people guiding it were my own children. I thought of Ruth then, of how fiercely she had guarded this home while she was alive, how she used to say that the walls themselves held the story of our family, and I swore to myself that I would not let those stories be erased so easily. That night, lying awake in the dim silence of my bedroom, I played out the scenario they must have envisioned. Me sitting meekly in some administrator's office while papers were signed over my head, my belongings parcelled off, the key to my own front door slipping from my hands. I imagined Mark, efficient and businesslike, coordinating the financial side, perhaps already speaking with the bank about power of attorney, while Claire presented it to me as, "for your own good." I imagined neighbours seeing the for sale sign on the lawn, shaking their heads with pity, remarking how quickly the old man had gone downhill. And worst of all, I imagined myself fading into compliance, allowing it to happen out of fear, too weary to resist. The vision filled me with a deep, burning shame, and at the same time, it awoke something in me that had been dormant too long, a determination not to go quietly into the role they had written for me. In the following days I watched them more carefully, listening for slips in their words, piecing together the quiet conspiracy that had grown around me. Mark called and, almost as an afterthought, asked if I still had the deed to the house in my files, or if it might be better if he kept it safe. I told him I'd look for it later, my voice steady though my pulse hammered in my throat. Claire began leaving pamphlets on the counter, this time not even pretending they were mere resources, but opening them and pointing out features as though she were showing me vacation brochures. "Oh, see, Dad, they have an activity room, and transportation to doctor's appointments, and you wouldn't have to worry about shoveling snow anymore." I nodded, feigning distraction, but inside I felt my fury building with each cheerful suggestion. The true crisis came when I visited the bank to withdraw some cash, and the teller, who had known me for years, mentioned almost casually that my son had been inquiring about joint accounts and what steps would be required should I wish to add him as a co-signer. She assumed it had been discussed between us, but I knew instantly that it had not. My stomach clenched, and I forced a polite smile while I completed my transaction, though every nerve in my body screamed with alarm. That night I sat at my desk with the account statement spread before me, suddenly aware that my independence was not just emotionally threatened, but financially endangered as well. Without money, without legal control, I would be nothing more than a ward of their decisions, powerless to resist whatever arrangements they chose. It was in that moment that the stakes sharpened. This was no longer a matter of whether I felt patronized or diminished. It was a matter of survival, of refusing to be erased while still alive. I knew then that I could not remain passive, waiting for the next step in their plan. I would have to act, to prepare, to protect what little remained of the life I had built. And though I was still only beginning to understand what that would mean, one thing had become certain in my mind. The battle for my dignity had truly begun. In the days after I realized my children were no longer speculating, but actually planning, the pressure around me thickened in ways that were both petty and crushing, as if the air itself had taken on the weight of judgment. Claire began arriving with a canvas tote that might as well have been an inspection kit, a pill organizer labelled by morning and night as though I had forgotten the difference, a clipboard with safety checks printed in cheerful fonts, rolls of bright orange stickers to label faucet handles and the stove knobs, and a packet labelled placement options that she slid into the drawer where I once kept birthday cards from the grandchildren. She would narrate everything in a voice too smooth to argue against, saying it was just to make life easier. Yet the ease she meant was hers, not mine, because every sticker she pressed onto my life declared that my house was no longer a home, but a case to be managed. Mark stepped into the same role with the efficiency of a project manager, and even the way he stood in my doorway suggested he owned the threshold. He began insisting that I hand him my car keys for a week or two until he could book a vision test, and when I told him that I had passed my last test 2 years ago, he smiled like a man humoring a fable, took the keys off the hook in the hallway, and dropped them into his jacket pocket with a soft metallic clink that sounded to my ears like the lid of a box closing. That night I found my spare key where Ruth and I had hidden it 20 years earlier inside an old gardening glove, and while turning it in the lock I realized I was already living in a kind of siege, rationing proof of competence, hiding simple acts of normal life as if they were contraband. The humiliations were not loud. They were slow abrasions, and each one left a mark that did not show until I went to shave in the morning and recognized a face that had learned to keep its anger under glass. The first open blow landed one Tuesday when Claire announced that a friendly visit was scheduled for the afternoon. Nothing formal, just a social worker from the county, and Pastor Joel from church dropping by to chat about resources. The word resources has become the bright ribbon people tie around control so that it looks like a gift, and I should have refused outright. But the strange courtesy that takes root in old age made me step back and let them in. The social worker was young and brisk, her questions practiced to sound like concerns, yet each one drilled a notch into the same ledger Claire has been assembling. Did I sometimes forget the stove? Did I ever get turned around driving at night? I considered the peace of mind of 24/7 support, and wouldn't it be nice to have someone else manage the small burdens like medication refills and laundry? Pastor Joel kept his hands folded in his lap and spoke gently about how God sometimes releases us from certain responsibilities so we can rest. And I sat there listening to the town's polite machinery move into place around me, while my daughter poured coffee and nodded solemnly at every answer she wanted to hear. When the social worker finally produced a slim stack of forms, not binding, just a preliminary care plan, something we can keep on file, Claire looked at me with the bright smile of triumph that pretends to be love, and it was then that something hard and cold rose in me. I said I would not be signing anything today, that I would review documents with my attorney, that this was my house and my life, and we would not, under any circumstances, be making plans without my consent. The room went very still. The social worker, to her credit, gathered her papers without argument, though she exchanged a glance with Claire that said this was merely a delay, not a defeat, and Pastor Joel murmured a small prayer for discernment that sounded to me like a blessing placed on a future I had no intention of accepting. After they left, Claire stood in the doorway, as if debating whether to scold or to plead, and then she chose a third path, the one that had begun to define her. She said in a voice near tears that the forms were just notes, Daddy, just a doctor's, note kind of thing. And she laid her palm on the drawer where I had hidden that very page with the line about transfer, as though her hand could press me into obedience through wood. What I did not expect was the public humiliation that followed. 2 days later, a patrol car eased to a stop in front of my house, and a young officer knocked on my door to conduct a welfare check, because, he said, a concerned family member reported confusion and possible wandering. I stood there gripping the edge of the door while the neighbor across the street watched from behind her screen, and the officer asked me to recite my address and today's date, to name the president, to point to the stove and tell him how many burners I had, all with the weary patience of a man who has performed this script 100 times. I answered everything carefully, because in that moment the smallest pause felt like a trap door, and when he finally stepped back and decided there was no emergency, when he tipped his cap and apologized for the inconvenience, I closed the door and leaned my forehead against the wood, and understood how quickly your life can be turned into a rumor you must disprove at your own threshold. After that came the photographer, cheerful and oblivious, who arrived one morning while Claire pretended to be surprised, and explained she had asked a realtor to assess options just in case, and before I could get him off the porch, he had already taken wide-angle shots of my living room like a coroner's documentation. I made him delete them in front of me, and when he left, Claire's face hardened into something I recognized from her adolescence, the look she wore when she had already gotten what she needed, and my authority arrived a day too late. The revelations began to arrive with the bluntness of bank stamps. At the credit union, an old teller who has watched my hair go from black to silver leaned forward and asked if I had decided which child would be my co-signer, because your son had questions about durable power of attorney and transfer on death. Designations. And it was only by pressing my palm hard against the counter that I kept the tremor out of my voice while I explained that no changes were authorized and any requests should be refused unless I was present. That same afternoon, a thick envelope came by, certified mail addressed not to me, but to the interested parties in the matter of my name. And because the mailman has known me since he was a boy, he slid it into my hands with a look that held apology. Inside was notice of a petition for temporary guardianship filed by Claire with supporting affidavits from Mark and a neighbor who apparently told them she had once smelled gas coming from my kitchen and had to guide the respondent gently back to safety. A scene I knew had never happened because the only time she'd been in my home this year was to borrow a ladder. The affidavits were padded with vague phrasing and an unkind mathematics of memory. My misplaced glasses were now routine disorientation. The bruise on my knee was a serious fall with unknown duration of altered consciousness. An unpaid water bill that I had set aside in a stack became chronic inability to manage finances. And at the bottom of Claire's statement was the line that welded the whole lie into place. Doctor has already recommended transfer to a nursing facility for long-term safety. I held the papers and felt a letter of my own life dissolve under someone else's pen. And yet, I would be dishonest if I pretended their motives were made only of greed. The more I listened from the edges of their conversations, the more I glimpsed the messiness of their lives, as when my granddaughter, sweet, wary Lily, texted me late. One night from a number I did not recognize and asked if I was awake. And when I said I was, she wrote that her mother had been crying after the realtor left because the second mortgage was under water and the clinic where Claire worked had cut her. Hours that Mark's business had lost a contract and he was behind on his own house, that they kept saying, "Once Dad is settled, we can breathe." Lily apologized for telling me and begged me not to say anything that might get her in trouble. And I sat, with the phone glowing in my palm, feeling two truths grinding against each other like gears. The truth that my children's decisions threatened to erase me, and the truth that in their fear they were trying to stabilize their own lives by shifting the weight onto mine. Moral clarity, I've learned, is a luxury of those who do not share blood. Still, compassion cannot mean surrender, and the knowledge of their debt did not lessen the violence of the forms they had filed. It only made the story sadder and the fight lonelier. Once I recognized the scale of what I was up against, I began to act in the only ways left to me. I called Harold Kovacs, a friend from the union days who had retrained as an elder law attorney after his body gave out, and he listened without interruption while I read the guardianship petition top to bottom. Then, with the steady calm of a man who has rescued other elders from the same net, he told me to bring everything to his office, and he set out a plan that gave shape to the fear in my chest. We drafted a new will and a living trust that placed the house beyond an impulsive sale. We recorded a homestead declaration at the county so no realtor could claim ignorance. We revoked any prior HIPAA releases that would allow my children to rifle my medical file for ammunition, and we executed a fresh, durable power of attorney that named a neutral fiduciary, a retired school principal from church, who is steady as granite, as my agent should I ever actually lose capacity. Harold instructed me to switch my bills to automatic payment and to keep receipts in an accordion folder, not because I needed the order, but because paper is a bulwark in court. He sent me to an independent neurologist for a cognitive evaluation so current and thorough that even a hostile judge would have to acknowledge its findings, and when I left that office with a score noted as above average for age, a weight came off, my rib cage that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Back home I changed the locks, not to keep my children out forever, but to force them to knock like guests rather than walk in as owners. I posted quietly but firmly a no trespass letter to the realtor who had tried to stage my living room like a product, and I told the bank to add a password to my accounts that only Harold and I know. These were not the actions of a man in decline. They were the small, firm steps of a man who has decided he will not be escorted out of his own life. Of course, my resistance did not halt their momentum. It only sharpened it. The following Sunday, they staged a visit with the gentle ferocity of people who do not consider no an answer. I found boxes in my living room, flat-packed and labelled kitchen, linens, books, and Claire holding a clipboard as if she had been hired by my future to inventory my past. Mark stood near the mantel with his arms crossed and announced that they had booked tours at 3 facilities for the coming week, and when I told them there would be no tours because there would be no move, he shifted to the tone he uses in conference calls and declared that the guardianship hearing was already set, that a judge would see reason, that I could make this easy, or make it hard. I felt my knees go light, and then steadied myself on the table where Ruth's sewing tin still sits, and I told them they needed to leave because they were trespassing, that the locks had been changed and they were here under my sufferance, that any further attempt to inventory my belongings would be considered a break-in. Claire's face crumpled for a heartbeat, and then stiffened into resolve. She said I was being manipulated by Harold, that none of this was necessary if I would just sign a temporary placement consent so they could stabilize the situation. And she repeated that phrase, "It's just a doctor's note," as if repetition could turn iron into cloth. I called the non-emergency police line and explained that family members were refusing to leave. When the officers arrived, they kept their voices low, checked my ID and my deed, and then ushered my children out with the same careful politeness they had used with me earlier in the week. And in the silence that followed, I stood among the unassembled boxes and let myself sit down, not out of defeat, but to feel the floor, to remember that I was still inside the outline of my own life. That night I could not sleep. I walked the rooms Ruth and I had painted with our quarrels and reconciliations, and felt each door jamb like a friend's shoulder. And when I finally sat at the kitchen table, I took out the doctor's note again and laid it beside the guardianship, petition, and the glossy brochures that smelled faintly of glue, and I understood that the next step would not be in my house, but in a courtroom where strangers would measure the story of my mind. I was not afraid of the measure. I was afraid of how easily a lie can take root when repeated by those who claim to love you. So I drafted my own statement, longhand, in blue ink that bled where my hand pressed too hard. Not a speech of defiance, but a record of the ways I still lived my days. The names of the neighbors' children I knew, the schedule of trash pickup, the details of my last bank transfer, and the cost of the prescriptions I had filled on Tuesday. The poem I could recite from memory because Ruth loved it. The tomatoes I had staked and tied that morning before the sun grew mean. I wrote it all down not because a judge would need it, though Harold said he might, but because I needed the evidence too. I needed to see on paper that I had not yet been erased, and that if my children insisted on replacing the story of my life with a more convenient version, they would have to do so in the clear light of a place where truth is at least invited to stand and speak. The courtroom smelled of paper, dust, and something metallic that reminded me of blood, though I knew it was only the weight of my own nerves tricking my senses. When the bailiff called my name, I stood slowly, refusing to let my knees betray me, and walked forward to take the seat reserved for testimony. My children were already there, sitting together like two pillars of judgment, Mark with his jaw clenched and his arms crossed as though he were bracing against a storm, and Claire with her lips pressed into a line so tight I could hardly recognize, the girl who once clutched my hand in a grocery store because she was afraid of getting lost. Their lawyer rose, speaking smoothly of concern and capacity, holding up papers I had never seen but which bore my name in shaky handwriting that was not mine, claiming I had forgotten to pay utilities, had misplaced large sums of money, had wandered from my home and been returned by neighbours. Each line was spoken not as allegation but as fact, and I sat listening as though someone else's life was being described, a ghost's life, a man already half gone. When my turn came, my lawyer placed the fresh medical evaluations on the judge's bench, 3 specialists attesting that my mind was sound, that my memory was intact, that whatever lapses my children claimed were no more than the ordinary forgetfulness of age. But it was not the papers that mattered, not really. It was the chance to speak. And so I told the judge, in a voice I forced to remain steady, what had happened. I described the brochures slid across my table like a verdict, the realtor who came uninvited to photograph my living room, the police officer summoned to my door on false pretense, the trip to the bank where I learned my son had tried to put his name on my accounts. I told them about the night I overheard my daughter whispering into the phone that I needed to be on the list, the day I opened the refrigerator and realized she had planted evidence of neglect where there was none, the way I was treated like a child while still living in the house I had built with my own hands. My words filled the silence of the courtroom like a tide, slow and unstoppable, and I could see the color rising in Claire's cheeks, the way Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, no longer so sure of the script they had rehearsed. Then came the moment I had prepared for in secret, the moment I knew would pierce deeper than any protest or denial. I produced the deed to the house, signed by all of us, naming me as an equal owner. Their lawyer faltered when he saw it, because it stripped the mask from the story they had been telling. This was not about care, not about safety. This was about control, about property, about turning a father into an obstacle to be removed. I held the document in my hand and said, "This house was supposed to keep us together. Instead, it has shown me how far apart we have grown. They wanted me gone so they could claim it without resistance. But I am not gone. I am here, and I am still capable of speaking for myself." The judge leaned back, her face unreadable, and for a moment the room was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the furious silence of my children. When she finally spoke, her ruling was clear. The petition for guardianship was denied. The case was dismissed. My children had no authority over my life, my finances, or my home. I had won, yet what struck me in that instant was not triumph, but a hollow ache, because victory in a courtroom is not the same as reconciliation in a family. I looked at Claire and Mark, and instead of relief, I felt the terrible weight of knowing that the line had been crossed forever, that trust had been shattered in a way no gavel could repair. After the session, outside on the courthouse steps, they confronted me, not with apologies but with venom. Claire's voice cracked as she accused me of humiliating her in public, of choosing strangers over my own blood. Mark spat words about betrayal, about how I had ruined their plans to secure stability for the family. I listened, the sunlight harsh on my face, the traffic roaring behind me, and I realized that nothing I could say would ever change the story they told themselves. So I said only this: "I am still your father. But you chose to treat me as a burden, not as a man. From this day forward, you will live with that choice, not me." And I walked away, the courthouse shrinking behind me with each step, knowing I had not just defended my independence, but delivered the final, irrevocable severing of whatever remained between us. In the weeks after the hearing, I learned that victory is a quieter thing than people imagine. Not a parade, but a long exhale in the middle of an ordinary morning, the kettle whistling, the radio low, the house returning to its own heartbeat after. Strangers have measured it. I put the deed back where it belonged, not as a talisman against my children, but as a reminder to myself that I still inhabited the life I built. And then I did the next right things without ceremony. I met with Harold to file the last pieces of paper that would keep my affairs standing, even if one day my mind should falter. I called the bank, not to boast, but to add a note on my account that anyone asking questions without my presence should be invited to leave. I stopped by church on a Tuesday when the sanctuary is empty and told Pastor Joel that I had forgiven his part in the resource visit, because forgiveness tastes better than bitterness, even when it goes down rough. I began saying yes to the parts of help I actually wanted, which turned out to be less dramatic than anyone expected. A neighbor's boy now shovels my walk in winter and refuses to take extra cash, so I pay him in pies and baseball stories. A retired nurse from down the street drops by once a month to look at my pill bottles and gossip about her garden, and I let the hardware store install a grab bar near the tub, because a man can be prudent without surrendering his name. The brochures went into the back of the hall closet, not as trophies of a battle won, but as a simple truth I could face without flinching. If a day comes when I cannot be safe here, I will choose where to go. I will pack my own bag. I will hand the key to someone I trust, and I will walk through the door under my own power. That, more than any gavel, is the freedom I claimed. As for Claire and Mark, silence settled between us like snow, soft at first, and then accumulating into weight. There were no apologies, only a single text from Mark that said he hoped I understood they meant well, and a voicemail from Claire that started with a sob and ended with a tight little sentence about how we all do what we must. I did not call back quickly, not out of spite, but because I needed the space to separate love from permission, to remember that I could hold one without granting the other. When I finally answered, I said what I should have said years ago. If you visit, you do it as my children, not as my wardens. If you bring papers, you take them away unsigned. If you speak of my safety, you also speak of my dignity, and if you cannot do that, then a polite distance will harm us less than a daily war. They did not like the terms, but they heard them, and over the next month Claire came once on a Sunday afternoon with a box of peaches and the air of a woman approaching a dog that might bite. We drank coffee in the kitchen while she looked long at the curtains her mother had sewn, and for the first time in years I caught a flicker of the girl who used to scribble me notes on napkins and hide them in my lunch pail, and though she did not apologize, she asked whether the tomatoes had taken and whether I still kept the bird feeder filled, and that was something. Mark has not come, but Lily did, standing on the porch with her hair tucked into a cap and a duffel slung over her shoulder, asking if she could help me fix the loose step, because she'd watched a video on it and thought she could manage. We worked, side by side with the smell of cut wood rising around us, and when we were done she sat at the table and confessed that she had told me about her mother's crying because she did not want me to be ambushed in my own life. I told her that secrets rot families faster than time, and that I loved her for choosing truth even when it stung, and I wrote her name that night into a letter she will one day receive from Harold, not as a bribe for loyalty, but as a testament that kindness travels forward, that a small act of courage by a granddaughter can change the weather of an old man's last years. I also returned to the doctor, not to scold, but to finish a sentence he had begun without me. He was nervous when I laid the note on his desk, the line about transfer catching the light like a wire, and I told him calmly that recommendations carry weight beyond the paper they are printed on, that a sentence can become a lever in the wrong hands, and that I expected in my file a new note, one that said the patient is competent, independent, and aware of risks, and that all future care decisions will be discussed with him directly. He typed for a long time, the keys clicking like rain, and when he looked up there was something decent in his face, the chastened look of a man who has discovered the difference between policy and a person. On my way out, I pinned the original note to the corkboard by my desk at home and drew a single line through it with a red pencil, not to gloat, but to remember the work of vigilance, because when you are old you become a country others feel licensed. To map, and you must mark your borders in your own hand. Spring came on the slow feet it always wears in Iowa, and I dug into the earth the way Ruth taught me, cutting channels, setting seedlings, tying the first thin stems with strips of cloth from one of her old blouses so that something of her steadied the plants as they reached for sun. I bought a second-hand record player and let Sinatra and Mahalia and the Carter family sing the kitchen back into itself, and sometimes in the late afternoon I would sit in the good chair by the window and read aloud the poem Ruth loved, the one about a line of geese crossing the sky like writing you could almost read if you tilted your head, and though no one else was there to hear it, I liked the sound of my own voice returning to me with patience. I wrote letters too, not the kind that explode, but the kind you put in a drawer for the day when your hands have learned to shake. One for Claire and one for Mark, telling them the small things they may have forgotten. The way their mothers laugh, used to catch on the last syllable of a joke, the patch of wall in the hall that hides a pencil line for every inch they grew. The recipe for the stew I pretended was mine, even though it was Ruth's, because families are made of facts that outlast anger, and I wanted them to have a map if they ever decided to find their way back without a lawyer. Sometimes, still, I wake in the dark with a rush of heat and see the narrow bed of a facility and the soft shoes of strangers crossing an institutional floor. And I lie there until the fear recedes, reminding myself that no door will close behind me, without my hand on the knob. In the morning I fill the feeder and watch the first sparrows land with the jittery gratitude of creatures who take what is given and fly off before anyone can regret it. I pour coffee and read the paper and circle every word I do not know, just to prove there is more to learn. And when I wash the cup, I hear Ruth's voice say gently, "Leave it in the rack. You've done enough for now." And I let the water dry on its own. Because that is the luxury of the living, to leave a small task unfinished and trust there will be time to return. If you ask me what justice looks like at my age, I would point not to the judge's order, though I am grateful for it, but to this simple room in which I decide the order of my day, to the quiet fact that my name is still on my doorbell, to the gravel path I swept myself, to the doctor's note with a red line through it and the space I saved beneath it for a single sentence in my own hand. I will go when I must, and not a day before.